Welcome back to the Daily Bread Bible Study, and we've got an interesting one for you today here for Day 40, Sunday, February 9th, 2020, for Numbers chapters 5 and 6. So today we're going to focus a little bit on relationships, focusing on relationships that we have with one another and unclean persons, but especially relationships with God. And we will talk a little bit about blessings and curses in this. Blessings and curses even around marriage as well too. So let me get into it in Numbers chapter 5 and just briefly mention that they say more about unclean persons, and that the idea that you keep the unclean persons outside of the camp as to, not be able to defile the camp or spread illness in our day and time is what we would be concerned about more. And so you'd keep them separate. Then a discussion about how we make amends comes up around confession and restitution. And so, this is something that is very near and dear to me as I'm trying to instruct my children, who are very young at this point in time, around how to care for one another. So we are called to confess our relational trespasses and to take action to repair those relationships. And this is even true with God as well too. So if you take an action against another person, it states here in verse 7 that you are to add 1/5 to it, and giving this extra to the person who was wronged. And this could be wrong that could happen, by accident. That there could be an animal, that is accidentally killed, or something happens that is your fault. That's an accident that can hurt your neighbor's property, and so you can compensate them, for that either accident or that wrong that has come about. If something happens, another relationship type of item, I see that this is one of the basis of Lutherans' confession and forgiveness, which is what we do at the beginning of our worship services each and every Sunday, is that we confess our sins and the ways that we fall short of this law that God has for us, and especially the ways that the laws have been written in the past. And then we seek restitution through Jesus Christ, through Him redeeming us and mediating our infractions before us. And so picking up on this theme, the Bible actually gets into it, and especially the New Testament, of this idea of Jesus being a sacrifice without blemish, one that is extremely worthy in our place. So Hebrews 9:13 through 15 has this to say: For if the blood of goats and bulls with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer sanctifies those who have been defiled so that their flesh is purified, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify the conscience of dead works to worship the living God? For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, because a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions under the first covenant. This sense of Hebrews, all of this priestly function that we're going to see in the book of Hebrews, is centered around this idea that we have here in the book of Numbers. This idea of how do we make amends to God? How do we make amends to one another? And how do we practice this restitution? And for us Christians, there will be a new restitution under Jesus Christ, because he will make a new covenant with us that will be different, in which God fulfills the righteousness due to God. I will say a note of this, that we can have the danger of confession, and when it's absent of any sort of restitution or giving back, or any action on the part of the person who's quote unquote the perpetrator or the one who commits the wrong, right? Then this action can just be like cheap grace. There can be no remorse, and there'll lead to strife between the individuals because the actual source of the conflict might not be addressed. You know, that you can ask for forgiveness, but without, you know, the actions reflecting that you have a change of heart, it's hard to build that trust within a community and individuals. And so I see this action trying to establish this trust and to prevent these actions from being repeated again. So they're trying to make, in their day and time, confession and restitution connected. And I think we as, you know, Christians should continue on and find ways to make amends to one another and to go above and beyond just receiving forgiveness, which is, you know, what we ourselves seek, but seeking to build a relationship of trust with the individuals through which we have harmed. So, moving on to another one that's kind of another intrapersonal and kind of special discussion. We see that this is a discussion around concerning a potentially unfaithful wife. In the Bible, it says an unfaithful wife, though there in this text it has a little bit of a disclaimer about that it could be wrong, that this wife has not been unfaithful to her husband. And so it's interesting here, and I feel like I have to make a couple disclaimers because this particular statute and practice really troubles me. So it's troubling in kind of three different ways for me. First is that I see that this practice is embodied for the women in order so that it's a burden that she has to prove her innocence, and she takes it on in an embodied way. And the second is kind of equal in the opposite way, that for males, there's no embodied consequence in this story. There's nothing that they have to do within their body and their body themselves. They don't have to put their bodies at risk in this, you know, whole process of determining whether the wife was faithful or unfaithful. And then the third part is a very big pastoral care, you know, thought that miscarriage becomes connected to divine judgment, which is not the theology that I believe. I do not believe that God causes people to have miscarriages as a judgment upon them. Now, that's what they believed in their day and time, and not to say that God can't do that, but I believe in a loving God who would never do that. So I reached out to a colleague, and in speaking with this text about to the Reverend Dr. Susan Schnelly, she helped me see that the story could be detrimental, especially to the mental health of someone who is wrestling with how God might be involved with the miscarriage of a child. So I could envision this psychological and emotional distress of enduring this humiliating process. It could lead to the physiological effect of miscarriage. So basically, I think this can be really harmful and detrimental to somebody who's either recently experienced a miscarriage or is still wrestling with where God is in the midst of miscarriage. And so my recommendation is that if this discussion could trigger you or already has, well then please stop listening now. So I'll give you a moment to turn this video off. So as somebody who wants to be faithful to discussing it, so let's dive into it on this discussion of unfaithful wives and miscarriage. So what is the actual process here? Well, the process described in Numbers 5 is that it's an elaborate process for discovering a potentially unfaithful wife, involving writing of a curse on ink and then washing those words of the curse into holy water that's mixed with dust from the tabernacle floor. So I imagine this rite is a very intimidating rite. You can see it in the heart of the curse, which is in Numbers 5:22. It says, "May this water that brings the curse enter your bowels, and make your womb discharge, your uterus drop," which speaks miscarriage. So this process it seems really structured with a bias that the woman is in fact unfaithful. And this process is meant to call upon God, who sees all, to help judge whether this woman was faithful or unfaithful. And so God, who knows what happened with this individual, God will be able to have, be able to see, and through this process of a miscarriage, or the pain, as they call it here, that will be able to determine if this wife was unfaithful or faithful. So the results of drinking the water, this water of dirt, dust, and ink, were seen as God's judgment, God's decree. Looking at it from our day and time, this punishment seems kind of excessive, even for someone who has been unfaithful to their marriage vows. I know they're wrestling with, there's no real graceful way to talk about unfaithfulness in their society, because that was something that, as mentioned previously, you could be stoned to death if you were caught in the act. Both the adulterer and the adulteress could be stoned to death, for that act. But since there was not a caught, no one was caught, then the woman would be put through this process if her husband suspected anything. And so, if she did it, well, then they feel like they're justified to have her go through this process. And, ideally, all of this would happen to somebody who was unfaithful to their husband. But this also, just think about it from the other side of the coin, right? If a woman did not do it, then what does this process mean? I mean, this process seems like it's a punishment that's pretty traumatic and demoralizing to somebody who would be innocent and who has been faithful through the process. And I couldn't imagine really what sort of moral accountability does a man have who would require this process to be observed by his own wife. He doesn't have to drink the water. So it's just hard. Numbers 5:31 says that the man shall be free from iniquity, but the woman shall bear her iniquity. I see this both as a statement, the summary at the end of this, but also to say, like, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, is that it just doesn't seem right and equal for the man and the consequences that could come to him potentially versus the consequences that come to the woman potentially. So, all of these things make me think about other things too, like drinking of this water. Like, how dirty is the water? Is it just a little dirt, a little oil, or ink, I should say? Or how harmful would we consider this dirt and oil mixture, or ink mixture, to be in today's standards? What potential side effects could the water have, other than just the idea that it would make your womb discharge and your uterus drop and bring pain about within you? So, I'm not exactly sure what that happens. But all of this, connecting to another biblical story, reminds me of King David when he and Bathsheba commit adultery together. So after Bathsheba gives birth, then the child gets sick and the child dies. And that's in 2 Samuel 12:14. And that is directly because of Nathan the prophet, saying that the child that is born to you shall die. And that is because of King David's actions of overstepping his boundaries in a terrible way, of having Uriah killed and trying to cover it up, and just all sorts of dysfunction around this. but the consequence of that is that the child born dies. And so it makes me think about this process, which is meant to induce a miscarriage or potentially meant to harm the woman who endures that or goes through that. So I don't know, did Bathsheba have to endure a similar process and then have an unhealthy child because of that? So there's a lot of questions here. But anyways, moving on to chapter 6, we get to move on to less about curses and more about blessings. So in chapter 6, we see the Nazarites, which is from the Hebrew word nazar, which means consecrated or separated. So these are individuals who took a special vow before the Lord, so that way they can, be committed to the Lord for that time, consecrated to the Lord for a period of time. And so under their time of consecration, it's either a male or female who would make that. They would be holy and set apart, which is kind of repetitious since holy means set apart. They would not be allowed to eat grape products, which are ones that could ferment, and not have alcoholic drinks that would be fermented as well. There would also be no hair cutting until the appointed time in which the vow that has been made would be fulfilled. The former time, if they had cut their hair, would be void because the consecrated head was defiled, as it says in Numbers 6:12. In Numbers 6:18, then it describes the special part of this vow, which would be shaving your head, and then taking your hair for the godly function. So it says in Numbers 6:18, "Then the Nazarites shall shave their consecrated head at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and shall take the hair from the consecrated head, and put it on the fire under the sacrifice of well-being." So that offering up their own hair, which has been committed to this special purpose and this vow, back to the Lord, and give that back. And so closing with Numbers chapter 6 is actually one of my favorite pieces of text because it is a pure blessing from God for God's people. And so blessings to you for surviving all the way in this podcast to getting this point in time. But we will look at the priestly benediction starting there in Numbers 6:23. "Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, Thus you shall bless the Israelites. You shall say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them." So a couple things to note. The divine name is used. It's the name that's spoken to Moses at the burning bush. And the divine name is invoked, which in Exodus 27 we hear, "You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God," because there is in fact a right use of the name of the Lord your God, which is invoking a blessing here. Then the divine name is also put upon the people. And so that blessings are going to follow them, and they will glow spiritually like Moses, for they reflect God's own face. So this idea that this blessing is one which they will embody, and they will be a blessing to the whole world, as was promised to Abraham, blessed to be a blessing. So may you individuals, may you who sat with me through talking all about the curse that comes to an unfaithful wife, may you know that you, God's faithful and beloved people, those especially connected with God and beloved, may you know that God's blessing is upon you, and may God go with you this day.